Welcome to the Cortana Analytics webinars. I'm Ashish Bhatia. I work as a Senior Program Manager at Microsoft. A very happy Learning New Year to all of you since we are starting the 2016 webinar series. First focus for the first few sessions would be around the data platform. And to kind of kick off things, we have Saveen ready today with us to introduce the Azure Data Lake. We recently announced service, and Saveen works as a principal PM manager in the Data Lake organization. So he's going to talk about Data Lake and show us some demos today. Before I hand it over to Saveen, let me quickly go over some of the bookkeeping items. This is a 1-hour session. We will have around 40 minutes of talk and presentation, and we will take questions at the end. Feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A window at any point of time. We will also be recording the session, and we'll share the recording and the slides after the live broadcast. With that, let me quickly hand it over to Saveen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Saveen Reddy. Just before I begin, just a quick few statements about me. I will have been at Microsoft almost 20 years in April, and I've been working in the big data team in Microsoft since early 2012. So having said that, let me talk about what is Azure Data Lake. So the first thing is, Azure Data Lake is not a monolithic entity. There's not a single product. There are actually 3 data lake services. Now, one of them you're already familiar with, which is HD Insight. And HD Insight, I would say, a good way of summarizing it, what it offers people in big data is clusters as a service. You go to the Azure portal, you create a cluster, and it does the back end, creating a cluster for you, managing it, patching it. So again, HD Insights, clusters as a service. And, we spent a lot of time looking at big data customers. And there was a big sort of effort trying to understand what they really needed and what would really help them adopt big data and grow their usage of big data. And so there are 3 things this discussion with many customers, hundreds, revealed. That was they would increase their use of big data if 3 following things were true. Number 1, it was easier to manage. Number 2, easier to debug, and easier to optimize. Because those are very, very painful things in traditional big data. So taking that into account, let me tell you a little history. In Microsoft, we run the company on a big data service called Cosmos. And here I'm talking about 10,000 developers, hundreds of thousands of jobs, batch jobs a day, millions of batch interactive queries a day across exabytes of data, right? And so that system has been in use since 2008. I guarantee you the company runs on it. We wouldn't be profitable if it didn't existed. So we built that, and the key number is not all the exabytes and number of jobs and millions of compute hours. The key number to focus on is, roughly speaking, the 10,000 developers that are using that system. And the only way we're going to be productive with them is to make sure that it's easy as possible for them to get into big data. And we actually address those very same 3 problems the big data customers told us about. Make it easy to manage, optimize, and debug. So we've taken what we've built internally, and we've shaped it and refined it, and really we're bringing it to bear as 2 distinct Azure services. So what you may have heard in Microsoft called Cosmos, that's the origin of Azure Data Lake Analytics and Store. So we've proven this at scale. Now we're bringing that ease of use and the ability to scale to the public as Azure Data Lake Analytics and Azure Data Lake Store. So these are 2 separate services that are in preview as of late October 2015. And Azure Data Lake Analytics is, I talked about HD Insight as clusters as a service. Azure Data Lake Analytics is big data queries as a service. In other words, there are no clusters. You don't spin up a cluster and pay money as the cluster is doing nothing. You simply submit a big data query, and we run it for you, and you pay for exactly how much compute time that query ran. Right? It's very simple. And Azure Lake Store is, it's a hyperscale web-based HDFS store in the cloud. And these two work together. Again, these are both in preview. Now, for the majority of this session, I'm going to talk, since HT Insight is well known, I'm going to talk mostly about analytics and store, but I will relate HT Insight to analytics a little bit more later in the presentation. So there are three things that we primarily focus on when we design, build, and plan for Azure Data Lake. And this goes all three, actually, all three of the services. And they can best be summarized by any data, enterprise, and developers. So a brief summary of each one of these things. So our vision for big data in the cloud is all your data can be processed by our system. No matter where it is, no matter what kind of data it is, whether it's structured, unstructured, whether it's files that are, megabytes or files that are a petabyte, we can handle all the data you have, right? Whether it be in Azure SQL DB, et cetera, and we're just going there. That's a key pillar of our vision, any data. Number two, enterprise, and it's no surprise here. I mean, we scaled out a big data center all of Microsoft, and with so much experience with enterprise customers, we know what's needed in the system here. So we're heavily emphasized on making sure that out of the box, that our big data services are acceptable for use in enterprises, dealing with all the such fun topics as authentication, authorization, auditing, and compliance, right? So those are serious topics that they come out of the box with Azure Data Lake, Store and Analytics. And finally, getting back to my 10,000 developers number, we have to make developers productive. And I think you will see in a little bit in this session and in a future webinar that we have done a great job making big data approachable and solve those key problems for optimization and debugging that are well in advance of what you'll see in the market today. So, there's something interesting going on at Microsoft, and you may have seen a slide like this. I think Satya had one that said, Microsoft loves Linux, and I just expanded on that. I want to assure you that Microsoft indeed loves open source, and Azure Data Lake is living that open source dream. And that'll come through a little bit in this next slide. So I talked about the two layers we have. And we have a compute layer and data layer. And compute, of course, is where HT Insight and Azure Data Lake Analytics live. But the key thing there is both those services work on an open source standard called Yarn. And in fact, we have quite a few developers that are very active with the Yarn developers, checking in code, extending Yarn. And you could think of Azure Data Lake Analytics as, in fact, a Yarn application, right? It's one of the largest Yarn applications you've ever seen. And, it's built upon this open standard, right? So that's the top part, that's compute. And that part lets us scale. The bottom part is our store, ADL Store. And the key thing there is it's built on another fundamental big data Hadoop interface called Web HDFS. So the long and short there is Azure Lake Store is a complete Web HDFS compatible store. If you have tools already that you're using in the Hadoop ecosystem that work with Web HDFS, then Azure Data Lake Store will work with those tools and add those features I mentioned about working on any data with enterprise requirements are met and making it easy for developers. So, I'm going to do a little bit of a demo later, but I just want to cover how fast it is to get started with Azure Data Lake Analytics. And it doesn't say store here because, in fact, if you create an analytics account, you get a store account. But let me just lead you through the steps. It's very simple. You just go to the portal. You create a new Azure Data Lake Analytics account. You'll be asked, roughly speaking, for just a couple of things. And you'll be basically asked for account names. You can say, Savine account 1 or whatever. And then you hit create. And you'll get an analytics account. And the great thing about that account is it's free. If you don't do anything with it, there's no money whatsoever that you'll be charged for in your Azure subscription. So having the account is totally free, and I encourage you to try. Once you have the account, you can submit using the portal or using Visual Studio a uSQL script, and in the future Hive scripts, to the Azure Data Lake Analytics account. and that query will run. And the cool thing is, and I'll demo this for you, you can actually, at the time of query submission, scale the query according to what you need. And then finally, of course, the query runs, and it reads and writes data from different stores. And the total time to create the account is about a minute to maybe 90 seconds. So it's fast. This isn't like spinning up a cluster and waiting 10 minutes. The account takes a minute to create, jobs run as soon as you submit them. Right? So that's how you can get started pretty fast in big data. Now, I'll just reemphasize the cost model for both the services. I already mentioned that the ADL Analytics account is free, and actually the Azure Data Lake Store account is also free. You only pay for what you use. In the case of the Analytics account, it's the amount of compute you've reserved for your query times the length of your query. And then for Store, it's built very similarly to Azure Blob Storage. It's relative to the amount of data you store, of course, and the number of I/O operations. Right? It's a very straightforward billing model. Now that I've done the overview, we're going to spend some time going deeper into Azure Data Lake Analytics. And the first thing is, we'll talk a little bit more about the yarn. So, this is a distributed service built on a yarn layer. And there's some key points I want to call out. And I've already mentioned, you pay per query, and I hinted that you also scale per query. That'll come in through the demo. But again, what that means is you'll allocate the amount of resources you want on a per query basis. The really cool thing about that is, you can scale up your usage of Azure Data Lake, Azure Business Needs Demand on a minute-by-minute basis if you need to. So you're not reserving a bunch of compute capacity that you're not going to use. Second, Azure Data Lake Analytics. Remember I talked about all data? Well, yeah, we have federated query. You can query across multiple cloud data sources in Azure, and in the future, even on premises. And I'll give details on exactly what's queryable later in this presentation. Enterprise grade, again, with security, compliance, auditing, role-based access control. And an exciting thing, this is very rare. I mean, how often does Microsoft introduce a new language? And we have with Azure Data Lake Analytics. It's called USQL. And it is a language that sort of takes the best of SQL and C#. And not only is it's a really beautiful language to program in, very convenient. Our developers love it. Also, one of the really cool things about it is you write this query and we automatically scale your code, parallelize it, and distribute it across maybe thousands of nodes for you. You don't have to become a distributed computing or big data expert to start doing big data things. And another thing we would emphasize is there are no limits to scale, right? Azure Data Lake Analytics can handle any number of any sort of amount of data you want to parse at it, throw at it, megabytes, terabytes, petabytes if needed, and it will scale appropriately for the data sizes. One final thing, even though I do mention federated query and analytics will work across all the data sources, I just do want to reemphasize that Azure Data Lake Store is truly optimized to work with Azure Data Lake Analytics. So the best performance at the largest scale will always be with ADL Store and ADL Analytics. Now, I mentioned federated query. Our queries work against all the data you have in your cloud. And here are a list of the query sources we have. So I'll just read them off really quickly for you. Of course, Azure Data Lake Store, Azure Storage Blobs. Those are both essentially systems that store files. But also, we can talk to systems that have structured data, such as Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL DW, SQL Data Warehouse, and even Azure SQL databases that are hosted in Azure VMs. So a single USQL query can read from all those data sources. So you don't always have to move data into a system. You can use the data where it resides. And getting back to my enterprise topic, we've really from the get-go baked in all the features you'd expect. First of all, we're already in the Azure Management Portal, the new one called in codename Ibiza. You're seeing a screenshot of it there on the right. We're already completely automatable via PowerShell. So Azure PowerShell today actually contains the commandlets that will automate and let you script against Azure Data Lake Store and Analytics. And we even, for those of you who are running on open source like Linux machines or even on Mac OS X, we have another command line tool for you, which is the Azure CLI, which is based on Node. And finally, not only do we have role-based access control baked in, also everything that happens in Azure Lake Analytics and the store, again, fully audited. The logs are available to you. They're secured for you. So come out of the box with all these enterprise-ready features. Now, big data applications, I mentioned so many developers. We in Microsoft, we want to make sure they're productive, and we brought some of that into Azure Lake Analytics. The very same tools we use internally are now part of Azure Data Lake Analytics. And the key thing here is that it's a completely, fully integrated Visual Studio environment, and you'll be seeing a demo of it a little bit later. It supports very deep, not only authoring with IntelliSense and code behind, but also it supports debugging jobs in a really advanced way that is really very state-of-the-art. I think it's quite shocking. And we've found that it's one of the most productive tools we have when you're doing really massively scaled up big data queries. Now today, our Visual Studio environment supports USQL, but coming soon this year, we'll also be adding Hive development to our Visual Studio toolset. So you can use both languages against Azure Data Lake Analytics. Now, there's another facet of developers I want to make sure I cover. We want to make sure it's easy to program against. So we have multiple SDKs for you. If you want to extend USQL, now USQL is a very .NET-based language, so we have a .NET SDK that ships there. But if you're doing other things, like automating the creation of accounts, or automating job submissions, or building systems that monitor your Azure Data Lake, we have management SDKs to do all that. And right now we have one in both .NET as well as Node.js. But coming soon, we'll have the same SDKs with the same feature set, also in Java and Python. That's coming later this year. So again, I want to make sure that we emphasize, again, we really love open source, and we're really making sure that if you're a developer and you want to work with Azure Data Lake, and whatever operating system, whatever language you want, will support you. Now, USQL is our new language. I want to give you just a brief tour of what it is, because it's good to understand the way it looks, and I'm not going to go too deep into it. You'll see a little bit later in my demo. But I want to cover some key features. So, what are the fundamental things you need to know about USQL? Well, basically, it is a mix of C#, SQL, and actually several SQL dialects. It's the best of a bunch of worlds here. If you're a SQL developer, you will find USQL very straightforward. Most of the syntax is directly taken from T-SQL or ANSI SQL. So if you're someone who lives in the world of select, from, where, group by, and you like joins, we've got you covered. We have more advanced things, such as window functions, etc. And of course, a bunch of extensibility features that I'll get into. USQL is cool in that, you think about SQL, it sort of works on tables, like structured data. But USQL actually allows you to work on both. So for example, you can read, again, from a SQL database in Azure, as well as, you can actually just read against a normal text file, where you declare the schema on read. So both are very easily supported in USQL. And there's a line there that is relational metadata objects, not a very clear line. And all that means is that just as a SQL server has a catalog filled with tables and views, etc., USQL has its own catalog filled with tables and views, right? And you use those things not only to sort of define what's in your system and make sure the schemas are known, but also it's in my deep dive in 2 weeks, you'll see how it helps optimize for performance. Now that's the one half of USQL, and the other half is extensibility, right? So USQL is really tied in with C#. The language sort of has both expressions. Sorry, it has SQL expressions and C# expressions blended together. And the cool part about that is it lets you reuse .NET code literally inside your USQL scripts. Or if you have libraries that do things like image processing or analyze text, You can actually call or parse JSON. You can call those libraries very natively from USQL. And then finally, USQL is really extensible in really dramatic ways. A lot of query languages, they'd allow you to maybe add your own data types or maybe add a quick function that calculates something. And of course, USQL lets you do that. But we have more fundamental extensibility mechanism in USQL. You can define not only types and functions, but you can create your own joins. Those are called combiners. You can create custom aggregators. You can create what we call user-defined operators, they're called, to do things like I/O. Like if you have special formats you want to read or write. The language is completely extensible. So, I mentioned federated query, and a little more detail now what's supported in USQL and federated query. And the point of this slide is to make sure you're clear that for Azure Data Lake Store and Azure Storage Blobs, USQL can read and write to both those stores. At the current time, though, for the other stores, only read is supported. So here's a little bit of USQL. We'll go through a couple of slides here just to teach you the language and show you some really interesting things about it. So I'll just sort of read from top down here. At the very top, you notice I say @orders equals extract something from an input file. And so the @orders, that's what we call a row set. It's not a table. It's not a materialized view. It's sort of a logical representation of a bunch of rows. And so what are those rows? Well, they have a schema, and we've defined the schema there because it's an unstructured text file. Right? It's not a SQL database, so we have to explain to the USQL system what the schema is. And you'll notice those types there. I mean, they look almost trivial that I'm saying int, string, date, time, float. That's actually quite significant, and that'll come in my next slide. But let me shortcut it by saying those are actually .NET types, not SQL types, and that has a dramatic sort of impact on how easy it is to use SQL. And there I'm extracting that schema on a file that's in the lake. And I'm using, it says extractor.tsv. That's a built-in tab-separated value reader that we have in USQL. And then I'm writing out orders into another file using outputters.tsv. This is just a very simple copy operation, but this is basically I show this because it's the simplest USQL script that you can have. One input, one output, that doesn't transform anything. Now let's do something slightly interesting. So notice here that I have select, I say customers equals select customer.toUpper as customer. This would look a little odd to someone from a T-SQL background or a SQL background because toUpper is not in SQL. What is it? It's actually an intrinsic method on the .NET string type, which is what customer is. So any .NET string method can be called directly from there, right? And that's another example that expressions in USQL are C# expressions, not some limited subset. They're exactly C# expressions. And below on the where clause, you can see customer.contains, and I've quoted Contoso as a company name, right? Because contains is an intrinsic method on the .NET string type, and I can call that method right here. Right? Now this goes even further. Right? What if I want to do things they're not intrinsic methods? Well, this is really cool. If I have helper methods, I can place them in a .NET assembly, a DLL file, and actually use them from within my scripts. So for example, in this case, I've taken some helper code and put it in a helpers.dll. I've uploaded it to the lake. And in my script, I'm telling the USQL, hey, there's an assembly called helpers.dll somewhere. Please reference some classes, reference the assembly, which is ordersdb.helpers. And then in the next expression, I'm saying rows equals select something. And right in the middle of there, I'm calling a C# method directly from that assembly. Right? And what's really cool is unlike a normal SQL server, you don't have to enable this amount of extensibility. You don't have to turn it on. The system it's turned on by default in USQL. You can, in fact, turn it off. So you don't have to go through this burden of configuring your system to have this extensibility. It's on there for your developers immediately. And then, of course, I want to give you just a little bit of insight into what it looks like to use our USQL catalog, the structured data. This should be looking fairly SQL-like. I create a table with a schema, and then I put rows into it. right? Pretty straightforward. And again, the reason you create these tables is not just so you have schematized data, but also, as I'll go into my second webinar in a few weeks, this is where a lot of the key performance improvements happen when using structured data with the USQL catalog. And finally, this slide is not very pretty, but let me try to explain what I'm conceptually trying to say. Basically, you write a USQL query as if you're writing code on one box, right? In your USQL queries, you never have to name a cluster. You do not specify anything about nodes or VM types or memory or what to do if a machine goes down. You just write a logical set of steps that transform data from input to output, right? That's it. You can have multiple inputs, you can have multiple outputs. And then you submit it to the system. The key thing about the ADLA, Azure Data Lake Analytics, that we will take that USQL script and any code that you're using it, just like those helper functions, and we will automatically parallelize it and scale it out to your big data. And we do that by creating what's the thing on the right, the weird green shape. We call that the cluster plan or the physical plan. If your USQL script is the logical plan, the cluster plan represents what we'll actually be doing. And our tooling, I know it's not obvious since this is a slide, is very advanced on this. We actually can show some interesting views on these graphs to show you literally, quite literally, where your hotspots are. And we have tools that let you see if you're paying more or less for your queries. And again, I'll go into that in my deep dive webinar in 2 weeks. So a common question we will get is analytics versus HD Insight. So the first thing I would say is they're not in competition. One is not analytics is not replacing HD Insight. They're very complementary things. Let's just level set though on what they are. Again, HD Insight is a cluster. It's clusters as a service. You ask Azure for a cluster, you get a cluster. That's HD Insight. And ADL Analytics is a different system. You ask for an account and you get it, and it's free. And behind the scenes, uncontrollable by you, there are thousands upon thousands and many, many thousands of compute nodes. And basically, when you submit a query, either USQL or Hive, you simply ask for a number of nodes, and those will be reserved for your query. And when your query is done, those nodes go way back into our little subset of the cloud there, right? And you don't manage that. We manage that for you. Right? Now, having said that, why would you go with one over the other? And the answer is, again, we expect that in practice people will mix and match the use of these services. And why would they do that? Well, for someone getting into big data that wants an easy time, and they want, it's all about convenience, and they're maybe familiar with SQL, and maybe they're already using SQL data, Microsoft SQL Server. What you get out of Azure Data Lake Analytics is convenience, and you get great efficiencies. Right? You don't get a lot of waste compute, and the thing scales massively, anywhere again from megabytes to like a petabyte of data, and that's done for you. Right? So if you want to get started, you go to Azure Data Lake Analytics because it's convenient and easy and has some amazing tooling. And I truly believe that 90% of what people are doing will they'd be better off served by going to Azure Data Lake Analytics. But sometimes you need more control, right? You need to customize the software on those clusters. You have Hadoop experts that need to control fine-grained configuration, and you want to do some really specialized things. And more importantly, you want to take advantage of tools in the Hadoop ecosystem or platforms that like Spark, Storm, or HBase. Then you go with the HD Insight Hadoop clusters. Right? So an example of how these two fit together is you might ingress a bunch of data, like an IoT scenario, into the Azure Data Lake Store. You might clean it up with Azure Data Lake Analytics to remove duplicates, normalize data. And then you might run a machine learning on that same data in an HD Insight cluster. Right? So that's how to think about what they complement each other, and we really do expect as people mature in their use, they'll mix and match and use them both together. So I spent a lot of time talking about Azure Analytics, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the store. This is pretty straightforward. So the store, here are the key points about the store, right? It is really focused on, and again, that theme of any data resonates here. The key thing about the store is you don't have any data you have. You don't have to do anything special to get it into our store. You don't have to, for example, chunk it up into small pieces if it's too big. You don't have to change it in some special format. Whatever the format you have, this thing can store at whatever size, right? That's very important. Number two, it really is a Hadoop file system, Web HDFS for the cloud. Web HDFS tools will work with Azure Data Lake Store. Three, again, back to my story about enterprise grade. It comes in with auditing, monitoring, compliance, security, role-based access control. And finally, or next to finally, there's just no limits to scale. So it means that if you're having small workloads, it works. If you have huge workloads, it'll work. Nothing is stopping you. That's part one. Part two is we have no arbitrary limits. There's no limit on the number of files in an account. There's no limit on the specific size of a file account. Right? You store whatever you want, as much as you want, we can store it. And the last part is the emphasis again. Azure Data Lake Store is optimized for analytic performance with Azure Data Lake Analytics. It is not something we just use to store bulk data. So some key points about Azure Data Lake Store. So we'll talk about why is it a reliable store. As you upload any data, it's automatically it's sort of chunked up and triplicated across our data centers. So you have a really pretty high reliability with as these chunks are copied in triplicate. And again, we have unlimited storage and no limit to scale, and optimized for performance. And that performance is I'll cover in the deep dive webinar in a few weeks. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide because I kind of covered it. I do want to focus on our enterprise features in a little greater detail because I think this is kind of an interesting topic. This is not something you see very commonly in storage at this scale. So first is access control. So Azure Lake Store comes with ACLs out of the box for files and folders. Currently we have them just in the root of the folder, but later on we'll have them for all files and folders. These are normal POSIX style ACLs. You may have seen RWX style ACLs in Linux. Same model we have in Azure Lake Store. And the cool thing here is that we take the POSIX ACL model and we automatically integrate it with Azure Active Directory. So when you create an account, a Data Lake Store account, you can immediately set the permissions for security groups and users in your Azure Active Directory. All the operations in Data Lake Store are monitored and they're audited, and those audit logs will be available to you. And what that means is, for example, you can create reports or do things like, well, who modified all the files yesterday, or what files were read by some user. All that's tracked, and you can access it. And finally, encryption. So Azure Data Lake Store supports transparent server-side encryption. So of course, when you're talking to it on a network wire, it's using TLS SSL. So the network traffic itself is encrypted, but on top of that, as the data is stored, that data will also be encrypted if you want to. Right? That's an option you can have for this, data in the Azure Lake Store. And if you're concerned about key management, you can manage the keys yourself or use Azure Key Vault if you need. So I've mentioned HDFS a couple of times, and I'll just reemphasize the point that we started this Azure Lake Store project based on Hadoop from the moment we started. We didn't tack it on. And the cool thing about that is it means that we're compatible with other tools. So for example, distributions like Cloudera and Hortonworks will work with Azure Data Lake Store, as well as existing HDFS tools like Scoop or Flume, etc. And of course, just as we compared Azure Data Lake Analytics and HDI, we get a lot of questions about, well, how would you compare Data Lake Store and blob storage? And basically, the very top one is the thing I really like to focus on. Azure Lake Store is it's really optimized for analytic performance, analyzing data. Whereas blob storage, supports more general purpose stuff, right? And what this means is effectively, you're paying a bit of a premium for Azure Data Lake Store because it's optimized for high performance. It's not optimized for cold storage or archival storage. Those are things we'll consider in the future, but right now it's really focused on analytics. The billing models are basically the same. In both cases, you pay for the amount of data you have in your account and how many I/O operations you're doing in your account. Obviously, ADL Store is very focused on web HDFS, whereas blob storage does not support web HDFS. Authentication and authorization are quite different. In Azure Blob Storage, they use access keys for authentication and authorization. In Azure Lake Store, it's integrated with Azure Active Directory. And of course, again, we use POSIX-style ACLs, not access keys. And finally, Azure Lake Store will have server-side encryption. Azure Blob Storage currently supports sort of client-side encryption. They have tools in their SDK to help you do that. And I believe they are also working on server-side encryption as well, but the timeline for that is unknown from my end. And a common question we get about Azure Lake Store is, look, how do you actually get data in and out? Just a brief summary of how it works, or your options. So there are actually quite a few services. So you can use Azure Data Factory, Azure Stream Analytics in the future. But we have also, you can use the Azure Import-Export service, and we have a specialized ADL copy service, which helps you move blobs from Azure Blob Storage to Azure Data Lake Store, just as a convenience factor in case you don't want to build an ADF pipeline just to do this task. There are many tools. Of course, there's Scoop, DistCP, and which are open source tools. And we have at least 3 tools we ship, which are the Portal, our PowerShell, and our cross-platform CLI built on Node.js. We have several SDKs you can use if you want to manually do it. And then, of course, if you really want to go hardcore or you need total control, you can actually call our REST endpoints directly using tools like curl, or just use any any REST client in whatever language you want. We're fully REST compliant, and we support OAuth 2 for authentication. And just as I showed the SDKs for Azure Data Lake Analytics, we have the equivalent thing for Store. This one's a little more complex. I'll walk through it. There are 2 kinds of things you'll do at Azure Data Lake Store. You'll do what we call data operations, which you can guess are like list files in this folder, delete file, all those. And so you have numerous options here in Java, C++, .NET, Node.js, and Python, right? And the key thing there is we are getting that support into existing clients like Web HDFS and the libweb HDFS, which is a C++ library. And then we have the other things, which are management operations: add a user, create an account, set policies, etc. Those are management operations, and those are done with a different set of SDKs. And we have support for all the language except for C++. Okay, I can take a few questions before I do the demo.
Sure. Let me pick up a few questions. How does the service fit in with Cortana Analytics Suite?
It obviously is part of the Cortana Analytics Suite. Is there maybe a more specific question?
That was just a general ask.
I can say, let me just give a general answer then, which is, we want all the tools, all the services in Cortana Analytics Suite to work with each other. So let me give the Azure Data Lake Store example. Currently, Azure Data Lake Store is basically can be used by 2 services: Azure Data Lake Analytics and Azure Data Lake, HD Insight. Over time, that'll expand. So things like Event Hub, Azure Stream Analytics, all the other services like Azure Insights can use the store. And likewise, we expect that Azure Data Lake Analytics is part of the things that your compute fabric in Cortana Analytics Suite. One of the many options you have. Any other?
Sure. There are a couple of kind of related questions, mostly around Azure Machine Learning and how do we use Data Lake with machine learning.
Okay, machine learning. Let me sort of answer a slightly broader question, which is, what if you want to do machine learning on Azure Data Lakes? So the answers are twofold, or three. First of all, if you want to do machine learning, you can, of course, use HD Insight and use their machine learning libraries on data stored in the Azure Lake Store. That's option number one. Option number two, which we're working on, is enabling Azure ML to work with data in the Azure Data Lake Store. Option number three is more of a long-term thing, and certainly something we are planning on, but not something that's coming anytime soon, is providing native machine learning in Azure Data Lake Analytics. And the important part there is it's not the machine learning algorithms we could add. It's the fact that we could do them at like enormous scale, far greater than Azure machine learning can do currently.
Sure. Thanks, Saveen. Do you want to switch to the demo or take a few more
questions? Let's do the demo. Okay. So I'm going to show you two demos, and I'm going to have to log into the Azure portal, which is the standard Azure portal. Give me one moment. Oops. And I'm going to screen share, so let me know when people can see my screen. I'm still setting up, and in a few seconds it should be available for everyone. Oops. Pardon the delay, I have to restart my screen sharing. In just a few seconds or so, you should be able to see something. Just give me a few moments. Is anyone seeing what I'm on my screen yet? Are people able to see my screen yet?
No.
Not yet? Okay. I'm going to have to restart Edge to get this. Let me do that. It seems to be having a little bit of a contentious problem here. One moment. Try it one more time.
Irene, you want to pick up a few questions while you're restarting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. Okay. There are multiple questions around what can the data lake analytics connect into. So questions around, can it connect to on-premise DB, other data warehouses?
Okay.
I think you answered all that.
So I covered the cloud ones, which were, the full list was Blob Store, Data Lake Store, Azure SQL DB, Azure SQL Data Warehouse. So if you want to talk about on-premises, let me back up and say Many of you are aware that we acquired a company, I think a week or two ago, called Metanautics. And they literally just arrived in our offices last week. So we don't have suddenly an on-premises story. But it is part of the long-term roadmap that we'll be able to do fully federate cloud and on-premises databases using what Metanautics has brings to the table. Are people seeing my screen now?
I got a positive answer.
Okay. So let me go, and I'm going to go into the Azure portal. I'm assuming everyone can see. Please let me know if that's not the case.
Please go ahead.
What was that?
I said please go ahead and share it.
Okay. So this is the normal Azure portal. I just want to point out a few things that may be interesting. It says internal because I'm logged in as Savinar at Microsoft.com. You obviously would not see that if you're not on Microsoft. And I'm going to go, and I'm going to show you how fast it is to get done here, right, to actually use the service. So I'm going to go to Data Lake Analytics. And I've already got some accounts here created, but I'm going to go create one here. Now, one caveat. When I hit create, I'm going to see this. If you're not part of our existing set of private preview customers that have been approved, you'll get a message here that says, hey, apply to be part of our preview, and you have to wait maybe a day or so and you get permission. But obviously I have permission, so I can do this. I just wanted to point that out. Anyway, my point here is let's get started in 90 seconds, I promised, right? So it says new Data Lake Analytics account. I'm going to type in Savine test 0. And look, okay, that's good. Only requirements, no spaces, no capital letters, no special characters. That's it. That's string number 1 I had to enter. Right here it says there's a big red star. I need a Data Lake store, so I'm going to click on this. And, well, I can use an existing store I don't want to. So I'm going to say create a new Data Lake store. Okay, and I need a name, but you know what? It has inferred the name from my analytics name. So it's taken the same name, Savinar test 0, and it's added ADL at the end. Okay, so far I've still only had to type in one string. Okay, hit OK here. Okay, we're back here to this blade. Now, pricing tiers, pay-as-you-go, just as I mentioned in my presentation. Now, I already have my subscription. This is a training subscription I use to do demos. And resource group. Now, it's defaulted to some particular one I didn't create. I'm going to pick a resource group that I want. Oops. Let's see. I have a little bit of clicking problems here. I'll click post-tech ready since I'm doing a demo in a few weeks. Otherwise, I would just enter a string and give the resource group name. So you've seen me type in one thing so far. And what's really interesting is what you haven't seen me type. Nowhere here has any numbers been mentioned. Nothing like how much compute do I have, how much storage do I want, no limits. I just had to enter a string, which is the account name, and I hit create. And it's saying it's submitting the deployment. And in something like 60 to 90 seconds, what will be created is an Azure Data Lake storage account, and then there'll be an Azure Data Lake Analytics account that is bound to that account. Okay, so 2 things get created by that, and it was pretty simple, right? Not a lot of clicks going on there. That's simplicity. Now, rather than waiting, you'll see some notification here when it's done, but rather than waiting for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into an existing account and just show you some things, right? So I'm going to go to Savine Big Demo, which is a demo I do at big conferences. And let's just take a quick look here, what you're seeing. So first of all, let me close this Essentials bar. Okay, so we come in with some built-in monitoring. You can actually see this first graph is the number of jobs that have been run, total number, which ones succeeded, how many failed, and how many have been canceled. That monitoring comes out of the box. You don't have to enable it even. And here is the number of compute hours which you'll be billed against. And you can see this account has had a massive spike in compute hours recently. And the reason for that is I started a very regular ADF pipeline. That's why that's looking like that. So built-in monitoring. And hey, you know what? Let's see all the jobs I've ever run on this thing. Now, again, out of the box, we record every job you've run. The script, the DLLs you submitted, and it's kept for 180 days. So we're already monitoring this, right? And in fact, if I really wanted to, I could, for example, go and say, hey, what jobs did I submit? Let's say maybe like between the 5th of January and the 14th of January, and I want only the ones that were failed. I don't know if any actually failed, but let's take a look. And so there we go. I found all the failed jobs. So built-in job history and archiving, and you can filter on it. And let me clear the filter. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay. Now, I always said it was really important for people to get started fast, right? You want developers to be productive like on day 0, right? So the cool thing is, and I'll open up Essentials because it'll be more clear here. You can actually start off with sample jobs. So for example, we come with 4 samples. There's going to be more like 30 or 40 of these by the time you GA. Oh, by the way, take a look up here. This thing went green, and I'll click this. Deployment succeeded. That was my account. My new account's actually already ready. In this case, we come with sample scripts to query some sample data we already have deployed in your account, right? So you don't have to go upload something and figure out how to use the system. Now take a look at this. This is actually quite interesting. So this is a very small script. All it's doing is just reading and writing. It's actually something I showed you very similar to in the deck. Focus on this number right here, which is called parallelism. And what that essentially means, this is when I said scale per query. What this means is that I can dial this number up. Now my account is kind of limited to a standard number of like 20, which is the default. But I can dial it, and what that means is, hey, for this query, use 1 node, or use 20, right? And you do this on a per query basis, right? You don't scale the account, you scale by the query. And I won't bother submitting the job since there's so many that are already submitted. Right? And then let's take a look at some other features, a little more enterprise features. And I'll do that by looking at Data Explorer. So you can see in Data Explorer, I'm connected to several storage accounts. I have a Savine Big Demo ADL, that's another store account. I have a blob account here. I have several catalogs with structured data in them, like tables and table-valued functions, etc. But let's take a look at Savine Big Demo ADL. And once I click there, I'm there, take a look at access. So these are the POSIX style examples I mentioned. So I have standard POSIX owner group other, and I can add other people as well. So let's add a colleague of mine, Michael Reese. I pick him because his name he's got a very short username, MRYS. Oops, MR. A little bit of lag there. So I type in Michael Reese, and look, it's already integrated with AAD. Shows me his picture. And remember, if you saw me create the account, I didn't say anything about AAD. It's automatically built in that we can use it. I'll click him, I'll select, and I'll say, well, I'll give him read permission on my account, but nothing else, right? And so that'll update the ACLs, and there you can see Michael Reese is now in our list of permissions. So pretty easy to set up and secure. And if I go to there's one more item on Enterprise Ready. If I close Data Explorer and minimize this and go to Users, you can actually see there are several roles we have. So we have, of course, owner, contributor, reader, but we have special role for Azure Data Lake Analytics Developer. So if I wanted Michael to submit jobs, I'd add him to this role. So this is a simple example of how you get started fast. In about 90 seconds, I was able to submit my first job. Pretty easy system to get going with on day 1. And again, I wasn't billed anything for this or for that new account. If I didn't submit a job, there's no billing whatsoever. Okay. Before I switch to my next demo, which takes a second, I can take a question or two.
Okay, I can pick up a question. Does ADL support MapR integration?
We haven't closed on our how that will work. Okay. Overall, our integration with ADL Analytics. Mm-hmm. If there's a more specific thing, I might be able to answer.
No, that was just a question. Can you send USQL queries over ODBC?
Over ODBC, no. Is the question there? I think one of the questions we often get is USQL going to be supported by SQL Server? Some people would want that, but we have no current plans to do that.
Yeah. And I also see multiple questions around optimization of federated queries, especially around the joins.
Yeah, so our tool, and unfortunately I can't demo the tools for you this way. We do have a lot of optimization tools, but they do work with federated queries, but I'm less familiar with how well they'll actually help you debug those issues unique to federated queries. For things that are strictly on blob or data lake store, they're pretty darn good. But I don't have any direct experience with how they work so well with federated queries. Okay, I'm going to go and I want to show you something. I've loaded up Visual Studio. I can't show you everything because I'm having a little bit of problem with I've installed some beta bits here. But you will see Azure Data Lake Analytics here is in the Server Explorer. And there are a bunch of accounts. As it refreshes, you'll see all the accounts that I have listed in all my subscriptions, right? And the problem is that I can't navigate into them because of the beta bits I've installed. By the way, notice Savinar test, which I created, now appears in here. In fact, I will just now it's working. Great. This is even better than I wanted. I can actually show you the thing I wanted to show you before, which is awesome, hopefully. But I can go in here and look at the catalogs, the databases, the jobs, and storage accounts, etc. Before I do that, I'm going to show you a really cool feature in USQL, which is, if you want to learn the language, you have to go submit a job, right? And that costs money to run. But we have just introduced, in our Visual Studio tooling, the ability to author and understand and learn USQL without having to pay money, without even having an account, as a matter of fact. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you. So what I did was I created a project like this. Oops. And it says USQL project, and I just hit OK. Now, I already pre-created the project. I just want to show you how I created it. So I'll open up one of my recent projects, wherever it is. This is it. And this is really cool because, again, the majority of our developers just really live and die by this feature, which is they write USQL on their own machine, they run it, they debug it, and only when they're confident that it will really run in the cloud, then do they submit it. So this will give you a sense of the tooling. Let me close this window here. And let's go here. So there's a USQL script, and this is a very simple script. I want you to read out what it's doing. It's extracting some data from a file. It's not a big file. And it's outputting it. In the middle of it, you notice that it's reading the search log, and I'm saying search log equals select star something from search log, right? And look at this. It says USQL1.applicationhelpers.my2upper. So I'm using a C# function, right? And I'm transforming the data with some C# code. Where is the C# code? If I look under my USQL script here, there's a code. Sorry, not this. There's a code behind value right there. And there's my code, right? So let me just go run this script. But before I do that, I want to just make sure we're clear on the output. So I'm going to find, under options and settings, since it's running locally, I have to tell it where the root of my file system is. And it's set to here, C local data root, which I can run. But instead of changing that or anything, I'm going to go to it and just show you what's there. I'm going to erase this file here. Okay? So there's my input file, and ignore these other stuff. All I'm going to do, just like you would in a C# project, hit start. So what's happening is this uSQL script is being compiled. Now, it has several phases of compilation. But what's happening, really interestingly enough, it's generating a C++ file. Yeah, and the C++ compiler is being used to run that, to generate an executable, which represents that program. And you're probably wondering, well, how does that work, the C++ with this C#? Well, part of that compilation also generates these managed code interop calls between the unmanaged uSQL runtime and the C# code I wrote, invisible behind the scenes. Now the thing ran. It says right here, local run succeeded, and it says it took about 5.9 seconds to do this. And here's one of my outputs. And let's go ahead and just click on it, even though it's pretty obvious what it is. I'll do preview, and there's the output, and you can see the column I added. It was just an empty string. This is it right here. So this is a way people can validate their scripts over and over. But what's really cool here is, in my uSQL scripts, notice I was calling this function called toUpper. Now, let's introduce an error. This is a great tool for debugging here. I'm going to artificially induce an error. Right? So this helper function will just throw an exception, and that's it. Right? It's guaranteed to give an error. So let me save this and close the helper function. And again, I'm just going to hit start again. Let's just see what happens.
So while you're waiting for the result, I just want to let you know that we're almost at time.
Okay, I'm almost done.
Sure.
The thing is running, and voila, look at what we've got here. The exception actually caught correctly. So I hit break. We're actually, just like you would expect with C#, we're at the breakpoint where the exception happened. And we can debug the code and look at the values of things. What's the value of this S? We can look at, do watches and use locals. Normal C# debugging integrated with uSQL. So I think that's kind of an amazing productivity tool for developers. Okay, so I've concluded my 2 demos. I think, are we done? Or do we take questions, or?
Yeah, we almost at time. I just wanted to be cognizant of the of everybody else's time. Savin is doing another session in 2 weeks' time, a deep dive session. So there'll be more demos and presentation. And to kind of sign up for that, there are more sessions planned around uSQL and the Data Lake Store in the following months. So keep a look at that, and we'll send you more information around this. We'll send a follow-up mail with the presentation and the on-demand link as well. Thanks for joining us today.